What if a single weapon small enough to carry on one shoulder could force a superpower to retreating? The mountains of Afghanistan, one of the most powerful armies on Earth, believed victory was only a matter of time. The Soviet Union had tanks, gunships, elite troops, and total control of the skies, but then a missile arrived that changed everything. Is the true story of how the Stinger missile transformed the Soviet Afghan War, shattered the confidence of Soviet pilots, inspired resistance fighters, and became one of the most important weapons of the Cold War. In this documentary, we will uncover 3 dramatic chapters. Chapter 1: How Moscow Ruled the Skies with Fearsome Helicopters and Air Power. Chapter 2: How U.S. applied Stinger missiles changed the balance of war. Chapter 3: How a superpower withdrew and why the consequences lasted for decades, from secret operations and mountain ambushes to global politics and the fall of empires. This is a story where one small weapon left a massive mark on history. Welcome to History Ledger. Let us begin. In the winter of 1979, the mountains of Afghanistan became the front line of a new Cold War battlefield. What began as political instability inside Kabul soon drew in one of the world's most powerful armies. In December, troops from the Soviet Union crossed the border, launched airborne assaults, and seized key positions across the country. Their mission was to rescue a failing communist government and restore order. Instead, they entered a war that would bleed for nearly a decade. First, the Soviet intervention appeared. Overwhelming columns of armored vehicles rolled through valleys. Elite airborne units secured cities and roads. Heavy artillery and mechanized forces gave Moscow the kind of firepower few nations could resist. But Afghanistan was never an easy land to conquer. Its jagged mountains, narrow passes, and isolated villages favored those who knew the terrain. And soon resistance began to grow across the countryside. Groups of Afghan fighters gathered under the banner of jihad. They came from different tribes, regions, and political movements, but shared a common goal: to expel the foreign army. These fighters would become known collectively as the Mujahideen, armed at first with rifles, machine guns, and determination. They struck convoys, ambushed patrols, and vanished back into the hills. Before Soviet reinforcements could respond, the war quickly evolved into 2 separate battles on the ground. The Mujahideen could harass and exhaust Soviet troops, but in the sky, the balance was entirely different. Their Soviet power was nearly absolute. The most feared symbol of that power was the Mi-24 Hind helicopter gunship. Part transport aircraft, part flying tank, the Hind could carry troops into battle and unleash rockets, cannon fire, and machine gun bursts in the same mission. Its armor could withstand small arms fire, and its speed allowed it to strike suddenly, then disappear into the horizon too. Afghan villagers, the sound of rotor blades often meant death, was seconds away. Helicopters became the backbone of Soviet strategy. They transported troops into remote valleys, evacuated wounded soldiers, and hunted guerrilla fighters hiding in caves or mountain ridges. When resistance forces attacked a convoy, helicopter gunships could arrive within minutes. When rebels gathered in villages, aircraft could bombard the area before troops moved in. Soviet commanders relied on mobility, and helicopters gave them reach in a country with few reliable roads. Mujahideen tried to fight back. They fired rifles at low-flying aircraft. They used older anti-aircraft guns and heavy machine guns captured from depots or smuggled across borders. Sometimes lucky shots damaged a helicopter or forced a pilot to retreat, but most of the time these weapons were ineffective. Aircraft flew too fast, too high, or too heavily armored. Every failed attempt reminded fighters of the same truth: courage alone could not defeat air superiority. For civilians, the consequences were devastating. Villages suspected of aiding resistance groups were bombed, fields and irrigation systems were destroyed. Families fled across mountains into refugee camps in neighboring Pakistan and Iran. By the millions, Afghans were uprooted from their homes. The war was no longer just a military occupation. It was becoming a humanitarian catastrophe. Beyond the battlefield, global powers watched closely. In Washington, leaders saw an opportunity to challenge Soviet expansion without sending American troops. The conflict in Afghanistan could become a proxy war, one more contest in a long struggle between East and West. Through covert channels, money and weapons began to flow to the resistance. Much of this support moved through Central Intelligence Agency operations and regional partners, especially Pakistan's intelligence services. Yet Despite increasing aid, one problem remained unsolved. The Mujahideen could survive on the ground, but they could not break Soviet control of the air. As long as helicopters and attack aircraft ruled the mountains, the resistance would always fight with one hand tied behind its back. The mid-1980s, the Soviet army was winning few decisive victories, but it was not losing either. The war had become a grinding stalemate. Every valley captured could be abandoned, every convoy protected could be ambushed again tomorrow. Still, whenever helicopters appeared overhead, the battlefield tilted back toward Moscow, then in secret meetings. Far from the front lines, a new idea began to take shape. If the resistance could not hide from Soviet aircraft, perhaps it could destroy them. The weapon that would change the war was small enough to carry on one shoulder, but its impact would be felt across the world. By 1986, the war in Afghanistan had entered its seventh brutal year. The Soviet Union still held major cities and key roads, but victory remained out of reach. Resistance fighters continued to strike from mountains and villages, then disappear into terrain no armored column could fully control, yet one advantage still protected: Soviet power above all others. Command of the sky helicopter gunships and attack aircraft remained the sharp edge of Moscow's strategy. They could punish ambushes, destroy supply caravans, and terrorize isolated communities. For the Mujahideen, every operation carried the same fear that the sound of engines would appear overhead before they could escape. The resistance needed more rifles, more ammunition, more training, but above all, it needed a way to fight back against aircraft inside Washington. That question had already become urgent. For years, the United States had supplied covert aid to Afghan resistance groups through regional intermediaries, but many officials believed small arms alone would never shift the balance if the occupation was to become truly costly. For Moscow, Soviet aircraft had to be challenged directly. Their answer came in the form of a compact American weapon, the FIM-92 Stinger. It was a shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile light enough for a single fighter to carry, but advanced enough to threaten modern aircraft. Unlike older anti-aircraft systems that depended heavily on visual aim, the Stinger used infrared guidance. It could lock onto the heat of an engine and pursue its target through the sky. For pilots used to flying with near impunity, this represented a new and dangerous reality. The decision to provide Stingers was made in secrecy. Deliveries were arranged through covert networks, with training programs established in neighboring Pakistan. Selected fighters were chosen to learn how to identify targets, maintain the launcher, and fire under pressure. The weapon was powerful, but it was not magic. A missed opportunity, poor positioning, or rushed launch could waste a missile and expose the team. Training mattered as much as technology. Then came the first battlefield tests. In the autumn of 1986, reports began to spread that Soviet helicopters had been shut down by a new missile. At first, some doubted the claims, but soon the evidence became impossible to ignore. Aircraft that once dominated valleys were burning in the mountains. Pilots who had flown low and aggressive attack patterns now faced an enemy they often could not see until it was too late. Their psychological shock was immense. For years, the Hind helicopter had symbolized Soviet strength. Now even its armored frame offered no guarantee of survival. A fighter hidden on a ridge with a launch tube on his shoulder could force $1 million machine from the sky. The image traveled quickly across Afghanistan. It inspired resistance fighters and unsettled Soviet crews in equal measure. Their immediate military effects followed quickly. Soviet pilots adapted by flying higher, changing routes, using flares, and reducing the time spent hovering over targets. These changes helped survival, but at a cost. Flying higher meant rockets and guns were less accurate. Rapid attack runs reduced time to identify targets. Missions became more cautious and less effective. Every sortie now carried a new layer of risk. Mujahideen understood the value of that fear. Even when missiles were not fired, the possibility of a Stinger could alter Soviet behavior. Aircraft were forced to respect terrain. They had once ignored convoys, received less confident air cover. Remote garrisons felt more isolated. The resistance had not gained an air force, but it had found a way to contest the sky. Surged among Afghan fighters, the war no longer felt unwinnable. Stories of downed helicopters spread from village to village. Recruitment increased. Foreign supporters pointed to the missile as proof that the occupation could be beaten in Cold War. Capitals, the Stinger became more than a weapon. It became a symbol of how covert aid could wound a superpower without direct confrontation. The missile alone did not decide the war. Soviet forces remained dangerous, disciplined, and heavily armed. They continued major offensives, used artillery ostensibly, and adapted their tactics over time, but the balance had changed. Every helicopter lost meant trained crew members gone. Every cautious mission reduced Soviet reach. Every successful launch reminded Moscow that the cost of staying in Afghanistan was rising. The war was no longer just a distant intervention. It was becoming a strategic burden, expensive in money, manpower, and prestige. Inside, the Kremlin leaders were beginning to ask a question once considered unthinkable: not how to win the war, but how to leave it high. Above the mountains, pilots scanned ridgelines with new anxiety. Down below, fighters waited in silence, listening for engines. The sky still belonged to no one completely, but it no longer belonged to Moscow alone. By the late 1980s, the war in Afghanistan had become a wound the Soviet Union could no longer hide. What had begun in 1979 as a swift intervention to rescue an allied government had turned into years of casualties, mounting costs, and political frustration. Soviet forces still occupied cities, defended major roads, and launched large offensives, but the promise of victory had faded. Afghanistan was consuming men, money, and morale inside Moscow. A new leader had taken power. Mikhail Gorbachev inherited a stagnant economy and a military commitment with no clear end, he reportedly described Afghanistan as a bleeding wound, a conflict draining the state while offering little strategic reward. Reform at home required resources and credibility endless. War abroad threatened Bhutan. Changing battlefield only reinforced that conclusion. Resistance forces remained fragmented, but they were resilient. Soviet troops could seize valleys, destroy camps, and clear roads, yet once columns withdrew fighters. Often returned. Helicopter power had been blunted by new anti-air threats, including the Stinger. Missile air operations continued, but with greater caution and reduced freedom. The occupation was not collapsing overnight. It was eroding, slowly. Diplomatic efforts gained momentum. Under international pressure, negotiations moved forward through the United Nations. The result was the Geneva Accords, signed in April 1988 by Afghanistan and Pakistan with the Soviet Union and the United States as the agreements laid out a timetable for Soviet withdrawal and principles of non-interference. They did not solve Afghanistan's internal political struggle, but they opened the path for foreign troops to leave. Then the retreat began. Soviet convoys crossed bridges and mountain roads that had once carried them confidently into war units, handed over positions, dismantled bases, and withdrew northward. Some columns moved under the threat of ambush. Others passed through landscapes devastated by nearly a decade of conflict. Cameras captured armored vehicles rolling home while soldiers looked exhausted rather than triumphant. On February 15, 1989, the last officially recognized Soviet troops crossed the Friendship Bridge into Soviet territory. The long intervention was over for many around the world. The images carried enormous symbolic weight. A superpower had entered Afghanistan with tanks, aircraft, and elite forces, and had left without victory. Why did the Soviets withdraw? Historians point to multiple causes. The war was costly and unpopular. Afghan resistance remained persistent. International pressure continued. Economic weakness inside the Soviet system was growing. Leadership priorities had changed under Gorbachev. And among the military factors, the arrival of advanced weapons like the Stinger missile increased the danger and expense of continued occupation. No single weapon ended the war, but some weapons can change what leaders believe is possible. For the Mujahideen, the withdrawal was celebrated as a historic triumph. Fighters who had once hidden from gunships now watched a global power depart across many communities. The moment was remembered as proof that determination and sacrifice could overcome overwhelming force. But victory did not bring peace. The communist government in Kabul did not fall immediately, and resistance factions soon turned against one another. Old alliances fractured. Regional powers backed rival groups. Afghanistan descended into another phase of civil war, one that would open the door to new movements and future conflicts. The foreign occupation had ended, but instability had not. The weapons of the war also cast a long shadow. Thousands of arms had flowed into the region through covert networks. Some were recovered, bought back, or destroyed. Others disappeared into black markets and militias. The same pipelines built for Cold War strategy would complicate security for years to come. Beyond Afghanistan, the conflict damaged Soviet prestige. It exposed the limits of military power against insurgency and highlighted weaknesses in the Soviet state. While Afghanistan did not alone cause the collapse of the Soviet Union, it became part of the story of imperial overreach. During the final years of the Cold War, just 2 years after the last withdrawal, the Soviet Union itself would cease to exist. So the story of the Stinger missile is not simply the story of a weapon. It is the story of how technology, strategy, And human resolve can reshape a battlefield. A missile small enough to rest on one shoulder did not decide history by itself. But in the mountains of Afghanistan, it helped change the calculations of generals, the confidence of pilots, and the choices. The sky that once belonged to Moscow had been contested, the war had been turned. But the peace that followed remained painfully out of reach. The Stinger missile did not end every battle in Afghanistan, and it did not bring peace, but it changed the course of a war, forced a superpower to rethink its strategy, and proved that even the mightiest armies can be challenged in unexpected ways. Legacy still echoes through modern warfare and global politics today, but history is full of moments like this, when one decision, one invention, or one hidden operation changed the world forever. And we have many more incredible, true stories waiting for you. So, if you enjoyed this documentary, make sure to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to History Ledger if you have not already. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep uncovering the past.